Hello everyone, welcome once again. This is the part 2 of the process mapping methods that we have been talking. In the previous session of this part 1, we talked about various type of process mapping. We talked about activity process mapping, which is primarily a flowchart where we use typical flowchart symbols to map a process, which tells us the flow of information from one end to the another, which can have multiple endings, and that's typically one start to and then we have flow of information between these two parts, the head and tail. We have decision making information flowing from one end to another, also going back, so we can see all that in an activity flowchart. But then we also have another type of flowchart which is called Swimlane or deployment flowchart, which is used. It is the primary flowchart or primary method of process mapping in every organization. So when someone says process mapping, the first thing they mean is swim lane type of process mapping, because in companies there are multiple teams and functions that work together, and when someone asks do we have a process map, they would like to understand, while we do this process we definitely interact with various teams, we are dependent on various teams. So how are we doing this process? How do we interact with other teams? And are we the slowest team? And where is the bottleneck in this entire process? If we are trying to understand this process is very slow, but you know that your team is very efficient, the turnaround time to do the job is from your team is very less, but the overall time is very high, which means that there is some part in the process which is done by some team. That's where process goes slow, and you want to understand that. How do I improve this overall process? How do I find the culprit in this entire process that is slowing down the entire process here? So that's where swimlane diagram comes handy. So it is a type of process mapping where we have multiple players in a team, multiple people working, multiple teams, functions, businesses, and a process is happening through all of them. So that's where we prepare a swimlane type of process map. If you can see my screen here, where we are talking about, this is an example of a swimlane or swimlane or deployment flowchart. This is this is an example of student admission, very beautifully explained. Here you see there are four parts, or there are four key players in the entire admission of a student. We have an advisor, we have then we have registration team, then we have administration team, and then we have the student. So these are the four different players or four parties. They interact with each other while the student takes admission or goes through the entire admission. So where does this entire process begins? As you can see, it begins from the top when student submits the registration form. It starts with the student submits the registration form. The student submits the form to the administration team. Now administration team will look at it. So you can see the administration team has a decision making box here, and it says, is the form complete? So it can be either yes or no, it cannot be maybe. So if it is yes, then the administration team will send this form to the registration team. Registration team will review the registration, and if it is completed, again they have a decision making box which says meets every requirement. If it is yes, then they will send it to the advisor for evaluating the admission. Evaluation of admission will be based on your marks, your test score, your 10th, 12th or graduation marks and all. So that's how they are evaluating, and if there is any fee, any scholarship, something, then the decision is will they accept or will they not accept. So if they are accepting it, then they will write the acceptance letter and they will send it to the student. You see, so if they are sending the acceptance to the student, so this process is now going back to the student. So what you see in this process, the process moving through various lanes. Now if you go back, if the form was not completed in the second step to do the administration, when the student submit the form, it goes back to the student. So this loop will continue unless the student completes the form. This is called a loop. So you see, it is going back. Similarly, the third step is when the registration reviews the application, and if the student meets all the requirement, if it does not meet all the requirement, then it goes to the administration. They notify on the rejection and they send it to the student the rejection letter. So again it goes back to the rejection. As I discussed, there can be multiple endings. So one ending is rejection letter, another ending is acceptance letter. So you see how the process is happening through all these different parties. It's a simple process, and so you can see not much of the complexity. But in the real world, when we are working in the corporate, when we have 4 to 5 teams involved, you can see going back to process, again coming back, going back, coming back. So this keeps on happening a lot of time, and it makes the process very slow. So in that case, Swimlane comes handy here. So what we try to understand is what are those process steps which are taking most of the time, and that is when from the Swimlane diagram we try to generate a lot of key insights. What we try to understand from a Swimlane is, as you can see on the screen, what is the total turnaround time of doing this entire process, right from step 1 to step 2. And if there are multiple variations that you see, acceptance is a process, rejection is a process, we call them variations. How much time each variation takes? If your application gets rejected, what is the turnaround time for that? If your application gets accepted right from submission, how much is the turnaround time for that? Different scenarios we get to the overall turnaround time. In the checklist that you are seeing on the screen, we also talk about each lane takes how much time. That gives us an understanding if the turnaround time for admission is, let's say, 10 days, but if the administration team itself is taking 7 days, that means this is where most of the work is happening, or either this is the busiest lane, or this is where the most of the bottleneck is. So if you have to improve the admission process, you have to focus on the administration part a lot. Okay. In the checklist, you also see we're talking about handoff. What is a handoff? A handoff is when a process moves from one lane to another lane. Like when student submits the application, it goes to the registration team. This is called a handoff happening. So if there are multiple handoff happening, that the process is very long. Then there is something called as back handoff. A back handoff, which you can see on the screen, it says when you go back to a step again. For example, if the example that we just talked, the student admission, student submits the application forms to the admission team. If admission team goes back to student and asks for more information, it's a back handoff, also called as a follow-up. If there are multiple back handoff happening, multiple follow-ups happening, that will definitely delay the entire process. That is not good for the process. So we have to identify what are those follow-up steps where you have to do a follow-up, which I called as a loop. Then you have to count and identify how many decision making steps are there in a process. The more decision making steps in a process will be further delayed, because each step, whenever you have to take a decision, you will take some time, and that is when the process starts getting delayed. So process should not have a lot of decision making steps. Number 2, if the process has multiple approval steps, it will be further delayed there. So these are some of the key insights we need to understand from a Swimlane type of diagram or deployment flowchart that will help us to generate those key insights, and we'll try to understand how does a process look like. So if you look at in this slide, you can see this is the current state of the process, which is looking very complex, going through multiple lanes. A lot of follow-ups are happening. We are going back to a lane a lot of time, different lanes we are going a lot of time. It's taking a lot of process, a lot of time also, and there are multiple decision making box also. That is before we had made an improvement. But team was also discussing how the process should actually look like in future. This is how it looks like right now. That's the current shape of the process, but they designed a future state also. So what we design in Swimlane, we call it an as-is process state. So how do we design that as-is process state? It is again a team activity wherein we work with different stakeholders. Different people from different team come up because we have different lane. We should have at least one representative from each team sitting in a workshop, and one facilitator. If you are a project leader or a yellow belt, you become a facilitator, and then you start asking questions. Okay, tell me the first step, and you use the post-it notes, put it on the wall, write the first step on the post-it, then take second post-it, write the second step on the post-it. So this way the entire walls fills up, and that is how the current state of the process looks like. Similarly, everyone has a process in their mind how it should be actually. We discuss in the define phase, we always map the process the way it actually is, which is the current state. Then we also talk about how a process should look like, which is the future state of the process. So along with the as-is process, which we have designed using Swimlane, using post-it, we also design the future state of the process, again using the post-it, with this same set of people, how they want their process to look like. It is very simple. It's like somebody is very fat, around 120 130 kg, how the person visualizes himself or herself. They will visualize, they visualize themselves to be a 60 or 60 70 kg, that's the weight they are visualizing. So they will have a picture in their own mind or how they want to be. Similarly, a process also, everyone has a picture in their mind how they want a process to be, without any bottleneck, without any delay, without any follow-up, without much of the approval or decision making, smooth process. So we want to capture their imagination as a future state process also, so that we can compare, this is where we are, this is what we have, and this is where we want to be, which is a future state. And the gap that we see between the current state and the future state is what we have to work, and that is called the process improvement, also called as the continuous improvement. So this is what Swimlane helps us to understand: different parties in a process, different functions in a process, how we are looking at now the complexity in a process captured by using Swimlane, and we also prepare a less complex future state process also. This is about Swimlane. And in the next session, we'll talk about the value stream map that will help us to understand, do we have all, whatever step that we have in our Swimlane diagram, do we need all of them? Do they add value to the customer? If they don't add value to the customer, why do we have it here? So we get this insight using another method of process mapping called as value stream map. So let's talk about value stream map in our next session. Till then, thank you for watching. This is Shivendra Sharma.